All right, well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm really privileged to be able to introduce Aimee. This subject is dear to my heart. I work for a labor union. And you know, a labor union is, well, social change has a lot to do with unions. You know, we built the middle class. But the question is, how do you act on your inner convictions, right? How do you do something that's against the grain? I mean, unions have a reputation for doing that, because obviously an individual can't really stand up to the boss. You need collective consciousness to do that. So can a person find the resources inside to take a socially active position on the outside that's controversial or difficult? Now, the Pathwork Guide always talks about the fact that you have to be faithful to your inner task, your inner voice, whatever it is. And in many lectures, the Pathwork Guide talks about the fact that what you may need to do may not be what society approves of. We've seen that in many lectures. Actually, it's kind of a theme that runs through a lot of the Pathwork. So this whole idea of going your own way, you know, taking a different road, standing up when it's a time of conflict and uncertainty, and taking personal risks. I mean, that's a lot about social activism. It's about taking personal risks, I think. You know, it's interesting. This is a time of so much turmoil in the world, you know, and one thinks about taking personal risks and how that worked out. My grandfather, on the Jewish side of my family, when the Nazis invaded Hungary, they organized he was a doctor, organized all the doctors into a work detail. And they said, okay, we need 2 volunteers. And everybody said, don't volunteer. But my grandfather raised his hand, he volunteered. Okay, I'll volunteer. One other doctor volunteered. Their job was to go to the labor camp and evaluate the prisoners as to whether they were fit for work. And of course, he said to them, nobody was fit for work. They were old people, you know, the young people of military age had been conscripted or had been packed away. These are the people that were still left. And my grandfather reported to the commandant, well, these people are old or they're sick or they're weak and they can't work. And he said, okay, I get that. But all the other doctors, nobody ever heard from them again. They marched them off. So when you have the courage to stand up and do something that you think is right, you know, go against the grain, maybe that's the lesson. He took an action at that point, and it turned out to be the right one. And didn't conform what everybody has thought that they should do. Well, it's just a personal anecdote. But again, Aimee Falchuk is one of our rising stars in the Pathwork, I think. And it's really wonderful the way that she brings forth the Guides lectures into the consciousness of what we have to do these days of our time. So let me introduce her. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time to be making this presentation, and I normally prepare really well. I have a sort of rigid nature where I prepare really well, and when things sort of went down in Israel this weekend, I sort of froze and didn't prepare, and I thought to myself, well, okay, so if I didn't prepare and I'm going to show up and give this lecture, like, what is it that I meant? If the preparation's over here and like just my heart is here, what is it that I want to reveal here? And I think what I came up with is clearly there are like gradients of evil, and we could put evil in a place where we're very much seeing it on TV and understanding what's happening. But our capacity for evil also exists, right? And it might exist here in the most mundane ways. It might be in ways where we don't speak up, like Alan said. It might be in ways where we realize there's an issue we should be a part of, but we find other reasons to do something different. It could be ways where we get pleasure out of demonizing a different political belief. Like, these are all, the guide says, these are all actually aspects of evil. And so we're not here, thank God, okay, we're not Hamas, right? And it's easy to say, well, if this is evil, then I'm really not doing anything wrong in the world. But that's not true, right? And so I don't know what to do about this. about evil entities, about barbaric acts, right? But I can do something about how I show up every day in life. And so that to me feels like this presentation really is about like, you know, short of going and fighting this fight, like what can I do in my small world that impacts the whole? And so that's really kind of the heart of the presentation. So this presentation is not one lecture. I found sort of 5 or 6 or 7 lectures that I think sort of could be Pathwork concepts that could very much be applied to how we address social and systemic change. And so we're going to explore that. And I want to do it interactively so that I'm not just lecturing to you, so be prepared to engage. We good with that? Okay, good. All right, so let's go to the first slide. Okay. Anyone want to read these quotes?
All right.
Yeah, we can.
In certain intervals of history, a new influx streams into your world because humanity has grown ready for it. Such a powerful influx must be accompanied by certain unpleasant manifestations that are not always present. Our outer situation reveals our inner reality. A person or system's life is what the conscious and unconscious personality produces. Not knowing this principle, or not wanting to know it, will produce the sense of being at the mercy of this world.
Great. So these are all from different Pathwork lectures. And the essence of this is that our inner world creates our outer world, whether that outer world is our own little bubble or the world that we live in. And until we become conscious of that, then we are going to feel very fated in this world, that we are at the mercy of it. And so this work, this inner exploration of ourselves makes us more empowered to impact the outside world that we live in, right? And if we don't do that internal work, again, we're going to sit back and feel like we are victims of our own system, a system that we are creating and perpetuating. And, you know, so this idea of like unpleasant manifestations, that goes back to this idea that like sometimes like shit needs to happen so that we wake up. So there are these moments in history that there's this build up, and we look the other way, and we look the other way, and it's building up until you hit a crisis point, right? And the guide says crisis happens when there's too much contradiction to the truth. So our situation now is very unpleasant, right? And we can sort of collapse in that unpleasantness, or we can say, okay, this is a knock at the door. And so the guide is inviting us to say, like, these knocks at the doors, you either look at it or you look the other way, and then the crisis becomes more grave. So now's the time. That's what this is saying. So next slide. So for me, this is just, when I ask the question of like, okay, what's happening in our society, in our world at this moment, these are the kinds of things that I feel are part of the current reality. If there are others, like, let's add them to the board, right? But certainly a reliance on technology, and the guide says that everything out of creation has an opportunity to have something spiritually beautiful about it. Consciousness will either drive it towards creation or destruction. So we have technology, it's an amazing opportunity, but consciousness often drives it towards destructive behavior. So what impact does technology have on our society, whether it's AI, social media, whatever it might be, okay? We're in a great reckoning of racial, environmental, and social justice. There's a collapse of collective trust of institutions and systems. I don't ever remember, I mean, perhaps I'm young enough or old enough, I don't know which it is, feeling so distrustful of every system. And I don't even know why I'm distrustful of it, right? But what does that mean when the systems with which we're a part of no longer seem trustworthy to us? Like, what does that create in the ether? What does that create in terms of brotherhood or sort of just how we function day to day? There's a growing battle between relativism and universal morality. So in the guide talks about there being an absolute truth. There are spiritual truths. We live in a world now where truth is sort of, it's my truth, it's your truth, right? There's a truth, there's the truth. Like, so that, what do you do when you go from a system of feeling like there are certain absolute truths that we live by, certain values we live by, And now we're saying, well, that's maybe not even true anymore. Now that's not a good or bad, it just is, right? Whether you're talking about gender, whether you're talking about, systems, it's like, what do you do when we move away from a value system that believes in a certain absolute truth, right? What does that create? The growth in secularism, again, not a value judgment, but what happens as we turn away from God, right? Or what happens when we turn away from spirituality or religion, right? Who becomes God then? Like, does money become God? Does technology become God? Does the system become God, right? So, and I'm using God for me. That's a word I want to use. It doesn't have to be yours. But what happens when we turn away from spirit? There's certainly a reshuffling of power. Up is down, down is up, grassroots, it's sort of the way systems once worked with regard to power are changing. Now again, that may be a really good thing. But if there's a reshuffling of power, it means people are losing power. And what happens when people lose power? They want to grip onto that and not lose it. And what happens to people who haven't had power and suddenly have power? What do they do with it? Right? There's a lot of shit that can go on when people are either losing or gaining power. Right? And so we have an opportunity to say, wow, there's a place where I'm losing power, and in that place of fear, I'm gripping. Or I might be in a position where I say, I've never had power before, and now I have it, and now I'm going to go for vengeance. And sort of dominate that person that once had power. I'm going to make them feel that I'm the powerful one now. So there's a lot of darkness that we can embrace as we reshuffle power dynamics. Me personally, I think there's an absolute decrease in curiosity of diversity of thought. Like, nobody's interested listening past what they agree with. The moment there's disagreement, we stop listening. And that lack of curiosity and tolerance for diversity of thought, I mean, what gets created?
You're moving away from truth.
You walk away from truth, you become tribal. Right? It's like you go where everyone's going to agree with you. You don't talk to other people. You start to demonize others, right? I mean, curiosity is it's a quality of the higher self. And so if you're not in curiosity, you're not in the higher self. So what are you in then? There's some kind of closed system we're in when we're not curious, right? So the impact of that, of kind of the divisions and the lack of curiosity. And then the last one I would say, there's an absolute depravity happening on so many levels of our society, right? Whether it's attacks in Israel or whether it's on the street. I mean, in core energetics, we use a concept called containment. Does anyone know what containment is from a core perspective? No? It's the ability, I'm gonna write down. It's the ability to tolerate the charge of our own life force. So what does that mean? It means that, like, if I can handle feelings in my body, anger, rage, sadness, grief, if I can tolerate it, contain it in my system, I'm less likely to either throw it off and act out or withdraw and shut down. So for me, this was my strategy when I couldn't contain. I would shut down. I'd take a Xanax or have a glass of wine or just isolate myself. For others, like road rage is a really good example of acting out, a lack of containment, right? And so, or controlling behaviors can be an acting out. And so when we act out with depravity or negativity, it's a real lack of containment. Or if we shut down and we're like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know what's happening in the world. I'm going to just live in my own. That's because we have an inability to just tolerate the life force that's running through us, the feelings that are running through us. And if we're unable to tolerate whatever comes up in us when we're in the presence of someone who disagrees with us, like, we're never going to be able to sort of coexist or move forward. And so our task in part is to learn to just sit and be in the presence of a differing thought. And just hold it and feel it and be like, oh, I don't like this. I don't like you. I want to kill you. I want to, like, just let yourself express it. You don't do it. but you let yourself work through the feelings, right? And so we don't do that enough. And so what happens is it gets acted out. So instead of dealing with the grief and the despair and the anger and the rage and the place in it that wants to kill, like, we just throw it off. And so this lack of containment is along with these other things, is like, this is a perfect storm for really bad shit to happen. That's my clinical. Like, Plato's principle was that our systems are simply a reflection of our own inner struggle. And so whatever we're in conflict about internally, whatever it is that we struggle with, whatever our darkness, our lightness, our goodness, or our ambivalence, our fear of death, like whatever it is going on inside us, we just kind of present that in the structures that we create out in the world. That sort of, if we put a mirror up of what's happening in the world and put that mirror back towards ourselves, we'd see that same struggle in ourselves. We'd see the struggle between good and evil. We'd see the struggle between wanting to give and wanting to take. You know, we'd see the struggle of fear of not having. Like that's all in us getting kind of mapped out to the external environment. So that's how I read that. But the good news about Pathwork is it's how you interpret. This is my interpretation. Just take it for what you will, or don't. But be curious about how I take it, and then contain if I disagree. If you disagree.
I'm pretty open-minded.
Okay. Anyone want to add something to this list that feels like it is part of the current environment?
So it's like the truth, facts, have become politicized and negotiable.
Yes.
So it used to be, we could agree that if something was reported by the UPS service, or what is it, or AP, that was factual. There was a protocol that they followed and what they were reporting to us, except for very exceptional cases when somebody was lying for their own self-gain,
Yeah.
and which was a very rare occurrence. That those were the facts about what happened, right? But now, and I think I can't remember the lecture, we did some work on this particular lecture, where one of the aspects of the dark forces, I don't use the E word because I think that gives it strength, so I call it dark forces or whatever. So is this idea that there isn't any truth, and how I individually see the facts, that is the truth for everyone.
Yes.
Right? And it's all about self-interest, perceived self-interest.
Yeah.
So we see it playing out in the political spectrum all the time.
Yes.
And it was entered by our former president. He made the truth negotiable, attacking the media sources. And not that he was entirely wrong about some of the things he said. I think we have learned some things from this process, but I think that that's a factor that distinguishes this period of time.
Yes, I would agree.
In contrast to maybe, I didn't live when McCarthyism was present, or when you have these very strong right-wing movements or left-wing movements that don't tolerate other points of view.
Yes. And I mean, I guess the way I would say here what you're saying is that we've gone from truth to narrative. Right? And so if you live in a world where it's a bunch of narratives, and those narratives are being portrayed as truth, and those narratives are based on either self-interest or distortion or agenda, what do we do in that space? Right? And that idea that there are universal truths, like the guide said, there are spiritual truths, there are certain absolute truths. It's like if we move away from that, where's the goal? I mean, the goalpost just moved, and I don't even know where it moved to, right? Because it's constantly moving if narrative becomes truth. And so that's the place where I'm like, what do you do in that space? I mean, I guess you have certain objective facts we can live with, but even those get questioned.
Well, I think what happens, unfortunately, is, so our truth, the individualized truth, it's no longer part of the universal truth, gets projected out.
Correct.
And what it focuses on is what is affirming of the individual's perceived
Yes.
interests
Yes.
and needs, to the exclusion of
Yes.
other points of view and the needs of the whole community.
Right, and you can see then how, like, all of these things, like, again, if we, let's say, my perception, let's say, like, that sort of being part, like, spiritual truths or God, that becomes truth, right, for you. And we say that no longer exists, and so it's narratives, right? It's like, that allows all this stuff to happen, right? And then we're just, the foundation is it doesn't, and now, again, maybe that's what it's supposed to be. Like, I can't say that's right or wrong. But it's like, we've gone from standing on a foundation of cement to standing on sand. And it's very hard to navigate when the truth keeps moving.
We're in a process of reordering.
Yeah, and my hope, and so if that's true, right, true, then we're so responsible at this moment we're so being called to be responsible, because if that ground floor is being rebuilt, like, who rebuilds that and how it gets rebuilt and from what lens or layer of our defense is building it is going to impact the outcome, right? So if we go to the next slide.
Well,
Yeah, sorry.
Amy, I just want to say, first of all, you mentioned who is doing this reshuffling or reorganization. And two elements. One is the leadership,
Yes.
which unfortunately does not exist so much in the world. And that's one. That's something related to that is, you mentioned all these powers. One, of course, critical power is capitalism. At the extreme way, we become just numbers to produce dollars.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I mean, the reality is that technology, social media, whatever it is, capitalism using us as just numbers, and it's tapping into our animalistic nature that really,
Yes.
and we become addicted without even knowing.
Yes. But in that, it's like we disempower ourselves if we don't see ourselves
Yes.
then as having to kind of work our way out of that addiction, or work that way out of sort of the oppression of leadership or whoever that leader is, right? But if we go back to the idea of technology and capitalism, it's like, again, the guide says that everything in creation has a spiritual meaning and opportunity. It's consciousness that drives it in one direction or the other.
It's interesting. I don't know. That's a debate about who create what and what for. So I mean, this is what's happening. It's up to us to
Yes.
create the meaning and to respond appropriately. I mean,
Yes.
I don't want to be apocalyptic, but you know, the universe is moving, and we can die if we don't take care of us. I mean, we
Yes.
can disappear.
Yes.
So what is evolution all about?
Yes.
Consciousness, not consciousness. Are we part of that? Are we gonna die after
Yeah.
that?
Maybe.
Who knows? But no matter what, we need to be not only responsible personally, but socially
Yes.
to shift that and to help.
Absolutely. Right, and that's the idea that, like, again, our outer reality is informed by that inner reality. And so if in the inner reality you feel disempowered or feel like I don't have a say, I don't have a place, I don't have enough life force to, like, step in and have an impact, then you're going to sit back, and then there's an impact on that. Right? The outside world moves on without us, without our ideas, without our input, without our higher self. So this is sort of a call to action, for each of us.
But they might be too late. Oh, sorry.
That's okay, go ahead.
No, ladies first.
I just wanted to add, you said, does anybody have anything to?
Yeah.
So I have two things. The first is, I think we are in an inflection point.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't think that until what happened in Israel. With the Ukraine, I could see it was coming, but I didn't really have the sense we are at the inflection point. But now I do think we are at the inflection point. And when you get to that place, I understand it mathematically because that's what I studied. You are going to go one way or the other. There
Yes.
is no treading water once you hit the inflection point,
Yes.
which I think we're in now.
Yeah.
The other thing that I see, which is actually something good, most of those tend to be a little bit not so good, right, is that I think there's a drastic increase in the level of consciousness being raised amongst a few, not all of us, but some of us. And I was just listening to Eckhart Tolle, and somebody point blank asked him how many of us, where this consciousness, obviously everybody in this room is included in this. He said he thinks it's about 10%. Now,
What's
that's
10%?
10% of people who are currently alive, who their consciousness is in an active state of rising,
Awakening.
growing, awakening.
Ascension, uh-huh.
But even, you know, we've got the 90, I mean, at the homily, so it's still like the good is, it's still quite outnumbered, but that, I don't think we've had that many people. I mean, I always joke about myself because I was so firmly rooted in, I was never a bad person, but the external world, you know, I'm a lawyer, I went to law school, you know, trying to get good grades, that whole thing.
Yes.
And now I'm much more concentrating on what's happening in my inner world. And I always do it to Joel, I said, if this movement that I can feel has got me, it's a powerful movement.
Yes.
Because I was not interested at all in anything to do with and it wasn't that I thought it was bad, it just bored me.
Yes.
Because I was playing in a different sandbox. And thank you very much, I had that sandbox quite figured out, and I wasn't looking to play in any other sandbox. But
Yeah.
now, I'm in a complete, so, you know, I'm just a one-rat study, but I do represent people who, you know, are like me and who are turning, their focus is turning inside.
Yes.
And so I think those are two good things.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
We, you know, sort of, because most of the things are not so good right now.
Yeah, and I think though that I would say like just one nuanced point to that is like there's turning in and becoming slightly narcissistic about that inward view, which is really not altruistic. It's more just like, oh, let me keep looking at myself, right? For whatever reason. And so that looking inward still has to be kind of grounded and founded in this idea that like it's part of some, I don't know what it's called, some greater good, but it is altruistic.
Yes,
the
yes,
looking
some
in
greater
is to
good.
be able to impact the out.
And you said, you know, what can I, this right here, this, we're not going, I mean, I'm not going over and putting on my boots, you know, to fight the evil that's happening right now. But all I control over is myself. And I believe that every single thing that I do and think and say is affecting, you know, it's just a pebble,
Yeah.
but that energy, including my thoughts.
Yes.
So, you know, I don't say mean things and I don't do mean things the vast majority of the time, but I have plenty of negative thoughts. And those negative thoughts are contributing to the negative energy that's
Of
out there.
course,
So
yes.
I try every day to be aware, and when I do have a negative thought, which is a lot, I don't fan the flame, you know, I see Tracy, you're thinking X, Y, Z, and instead
Right.
of though, I don't perpetuate, I don't add more flames to the already
Right, and
raging
that's a form
fire.
of containment. Like,
Right.
okay, I have a negative thought. Like, I'm going to let it run through me.
Yes.
I'm not going to act out on it. I'm not going to shut it down so
Right.
that my whole system shuts down. So, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
You
So
know,
let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so I mean, this is what, you know, this is from the Spiritual Meaning of Crisis lecture, which I just think is a great, we did this when the pandemic first started. We had a
Right.
conversation about this lecture, but yeah, so crisis happens when there's too much contradiction to the truth. So it begs the question, like, what truths are we contradicting that's creating the current crisis? So next slide. So these are from Spiritual Laws lecture, and these are just some that I pulled out, right? And because it makes sense to me. Like, okay, what truths are we contradicting? The law of personal responsibility, that feels clear to me. That feels clear in my life, right? Like, I'm not taking a lot of responsibility in my personal life, in my, you know, and I see the impact it has, right? And when we don't take responsibility, we tend to be in blame. So you can see that out in the world. We're blaming everybody. It's your fault. You're a man, it's your fault. I'm unhappy as a woman because of you. You're a man. You took something from me, right? Like, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe that once was true, right? But at the end of the day, like, what am I not taking responsibility for, right? So if we are not in the law of personal responsibility, then we're going to compensate by blaming others, and then that has an impact on our culture and society. So having a weak ego or being highly attached to the ego demands that life be our way. And then we're out in the world controlling, making sure life is our way. What's the impact of that on a culture or society? If we're all walking around over-identifying with our ego and our attachment to our ego and demanding that life be our way. Like, what impact does that have on culture and society?
It's opposites. It's not an understanding. We're not understanding each other.
No, we're walking around and we're basically being like, me. I'm the important one. What I want matters. What I want matters, and I'm going to control for it,
And
right?
it's my way.
Right, my way. So we've got to sort of balance out this idea that our ego is meant to actually be in service to the greater will, not our own little will. Right? The law of brotherhood, clearly we're not following, and it creates separateness. And what does separateness create in a culture or society? Right? The idea of you must lose what you want to gain. Right? So here we are trying to shuffle power dynamics and sort of we want more equality. But in order to do that, we have to give something up. Right? And there's a fear of like, if I even though I want freedom or equality, I'd have to give up something of mine, and I'm so attached to my ego and what I want, then I'm afraid that if I lose this thing that I have, then I'll be nothing, and so I'm not going to give it away. And so we want equality, but we really kind of don't. And so we can say we want something, but unless we're willing to give up something in ourselves in order for the greater good to have something, it won't change. Right? And the unitive law, it's just similar to the law of brotherhood in the sense of like, us not seeing that you can have two political parties who see things very differently, but if you don't understand that there's a sort of unitive consciousness even in the differences, it keeps us separate. And in that separateness, we can't find connection. And so we tend to dehumanize or demonize the other, as if there is an other.
Can you speak? Sorry.
Yeah.
You have there the involuntary manifestation of the universal guidance. Could you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, so in that, what it's saying is that in our ego-controlled state, we block the spontaneous self. And it's in the spontaneous self where it's like our intuition is, our inner wisdom is, it's like our joy is, like our openness is, like our healthy aggression might live. And so if we're tightly wound, tightly controlled by the ego out of fear or demand that it be our way, which is really fear, then that real part of us that actually could affect change in the world never gets to manifest. Right? Does that make sense? That it's like it's the blocking of the spontaneous self that obstructs whatever that spontaneous self could bring to changing the world. And our demand, my will. Right? It's like, how can that sort of force work through us of thy will, let's just say it, if it's like, no, my will. That's the wrestling with the angels idea for me, right? And it's like, just stop fighting and surrender over and trust that like that inner wisdom, your ego, your healthy ego plus the inner wisdom of that spontaneous energy that's coming through you, that's the thing that can propel us forward, right? But instead, we kind of lead with a tight fist, which is the ego. The unhealthy ego, the child ego, right? Does it feel like, okay, cool. Okay, next slide. All right, so who approaches social change through their higher self all the time? Not me. Can you feel any of your higher self and how you approach social change? Like any of those up there? I feel like I have curiosity at times. I feel like I really do feel the pain of the struggle for justice. I really feel that. I felt that this weekend in Israel. And I think moral reflection, I think a lot of us, I think with the pandemic and a lot of the racial and social justice, I think has really created a space for moral reflection, right? How about lower self?
You know what, I'm
Yeah.
just looking at these, I see myself in all, I have every single one of those, in the higher self, in the lower self, and in the rest.
Yeah.
They're all present in me. It's just, every single thing you've listed, I'm like, yes, and then I was like, well, I have everything. So it's more like the balance, but how much time am I in my higher self
Yes.
versus the lower self versus that?
Yeah.
But it's not that nothing is lacking in me that's on that board.
Right, I mean, ideally though, it's like if we're approaching social change through the mask or lower self, the impact that's gonna have on actually affecting positive change is pretty low.
It won't.
It won't.
It won't. It will have the opposite effect.
Right.
But if I'm really sitting here being honest with myself, there's times where I blame, I judge, I think, I mean, I do. Do I do it? No.
Right.
But I do it.
Yeah.
So it's all in me.
Yes, and the work is to, you know, I know, I mean, so I can share that like this weekend, I did not want to hold space for the other side. Like, it's like, I didn't care in that moment about the civilians living in Gaza. I did not care, right? And I let myself just, okay, that's how I'm feeling right now, right? I feel very impacted by what happened in Israel to my family. I'm not holding space for these other people that are clearly suffering. My heart is closed to them in this moment, right? I didn't act on it, I didn't do it, but I had to own, I had to reflect morally of like, there's a part of me that's like literally becoming indifferent to other people's suffering because of my own. And I don't know what to do with it. I'm still in process, right? But like being able to reflect on that morally means that I've moved from the lower self of indifference or even cruelty of like, I don't care, to moral reflecting and saying like, what's going on in me that I don't care? Because I do care, of course I care, but in my hurt and in my outrage, it's like I shut someone out. And so it's like we have to slow ourselves down. And to your point about media, there's no slowing down. So there's not even a moment to just stop for a second and just be like, okay, like, yes, of course I care about other people. Right now I don't, just give me a second, right? But our outside system is moving so fast and putting us in our nervous system is so hyper aroused that we're always in reaction, right? And in behavioral therapy, it's like, you know, there's stimulus and then there's response. And what impacts response is the pause. Mm-hmm. If we don't pause, we're going to react. Mm-hmm. If we pause, we're more likely to respond in a reflective way, right? So that moral reflection allows us to be like, okay, something happened, I'm outraged. My instinct is to become indifferent towards someone else's suffering because of my own. And if I could just give it a second and just let myself work through it, right? I'm not going to stay in this reactive place of like, who cares? That's their problem. I'm going to go to a more responsive place being like, how painful is this? Right? So we can move from mask lower self to higher self, but we have to own that we're in our mask or lower self when it relates to social change.
Just to add, clearly it's Viktor Frankl,
yes,
statement, but I think moral reflection is specifically, I think it's important for social growth, but reflection in general, I think it's one of the most important aspects, and it stays in the pose, yes, where we can stop.
Yes.
Doing it, you know, in Buddhism there is something that's called bhavana.
Bhavana?
Yeah, which is purification of intention, or purification of the motivation.
Yes.
To try to understand where is it coming from.
Yes.
Yes? And try to understand, but once we understand, is it coming from, in our language, in the lower self or the higher self?
Yes.
Is it coming from based on fear or from love?
Love. Yes, absolutely. And the guide says that too, of like really, you know, I think the lecture about the healthy and unhealthy motives and desire. Like, why do I really want something? What's motivating that? And if I can purify that, I can understand what's motivating it, love or fear, expectation, other, then like I can choose better, right? But again, that reflection, take out moral, just the reflection is what's necessary. And when we can't contain, we go back to containment, if we're unable to contain, we're not going to reflect. Because
but we have to be guided by you reflect, but there is a goal for the reflection. And I think the morality is the guidance.
Yes, agreed, right? But I'll take just neutral reflection, just as even a starting point,
yes.
Right? Because in our, I mean, I think because again, if we're talking about the environment, because we are unable to tolerate our energy in our system, which is our feelings, we don't pause, and because we don't pause, we don't reflect, right? And so whether we're reflecting morally or just reflecting, it still requires us to slow down and pause. And so the invitation is for the pause.
That's true, but it won't be enough, in
No.
my opinion. You have to take it to the next level.
Absolutely.
You have to direct it.
Yes, agreed. I agree. I'm in agreement, yeah. You know, I was thinking this weekend listening to some of the news reports, it's like the epitome of hypocrisy in this world we're in now is that when nuance and context matters only when it serves a narrative. But nuance and context doesn't matter if it doesn't serve the narrative. So something's either very black or white because that's black or white, or something's nuanced. And it really depends on where you sit. And that exists. Right? It's like depending on whether we care about an issue, what we think about an issue. Like the guide says hypocrisy is the unwillingness to be in the truth of something. That's what hypocrisy is identified as in the guide. Right? So it's if we want to have context for certain narratives and no context for others, like we're not in truth. We're not willing to be in the consequence of truth. And we have to own that. Yes, and this isn't a political statement, but I would say that like identity politics is a lot of othering.
Yes.
Even
Yes.
if othering for good, like but we're othering.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, again, it's not all good or all bad, but like what's the impact of that? Because we're creating separate categories. Now we're doing that because we want rights for those categories. So it's like, it's tricky, right? It has it can have a good motivation and it can have a motivation that's potentially harmful to the greater challenge. So it's like, these are the things we want to reflect on, right? And again, it's like, I'm talking about it, I'm not talking about here, that we're supposed to sit and listen and have the capacity to listen beyond agreement, because there is evil in the world. There is an entity, an energy that creates, but here we do have the capacity to listen beyond the agreement. But we have to be able to contain and be able to tolerate what's coming up in us when someone says something that we don't agree with.
Exactly.
Right? And that's the work. That's the somatic piece of the work. Right? And the spiritual work is not my will. Right? And that's hard. When we're so attached to the ego that says, no, it has to be my way, right? But, okay. So this is a good slide. I'll send you the slides after if you want them, because I think this is really helpful to like look at, to really understand yourself and others and your communities about like, what are we doing collectively or individually that's not supporting moving us forward? Right? So let's go to the next slide. I mean, I feel like we've talked about this, which is, the more attached we are to our ego, the more fearful we are of losing that identity. And the more fearful we are of losing our identity, the more we're going to channel our energy towards staving it off. And when you're trying to make change in the world, you want to go towards something expansive, not something just preserving. Right? So the guide says like we live in two worlds. We either we live in the world of self-preservation or self-expression. And self-preservation is just it's in a good thing, it's to stay alive. But like from the ego's perspective, from ego consciousness, it's like, oh, I got to keep this alive. I got to keep me, Aimee, my identity, my whatever, right? I always bring up the anti-aging movement. To me, is like a great example of ego state of consciousness. So I'm channeling all my energy towards not aging versus accepting that like that's going to happen and then channeling my energy towards something life-affirming. Right? It's more self-expressive, right? So the more that we are reliant on material, first and foremost being our own ego identity, the more likely we're going to spend all our energy preserving that. And when we're preserving our own narcissistic selves, what aren't we doing out in the world? So I do buy anti-aging products for my face, but I don't obsess about it.
That's what you think.
What?
That's what you think.
What, that I don't obsess about it?
Yeah, I'm joking.
No, but again, it's like, it's such a, anyone should do whatever they want to do. But again, the guide says that like, we have two choices what we do with our energy. We either send it towards staving off a certainty, which is aging or dying, right? But we push it off, and that's where we're spending our energy, just pushing off something that's already going to happen. So in this stance, there's not a lot that can happen. Versus like this, which is like, I'm open. to go towards life, right? To give out to the world. Like that's a different energy than this, right? So in that place of our attachment to our ego identity, we tend to live in fear. I mean, that's essentially what it is. And then in fear, we tend to control, right? And so we send our energy in one direction versus another. So that's what this piece is about. Does that make sense? If you didn't think you were so important, or if you didn't have an unresolved relationship with death, you might live in the world really differently.
You would.
Right? Like the guide says, like those who know how to die know how to live. So if you're staving off death all the time, you're not living. And if you're not living, what impact aren't you having in creating a better world?
And what are you, I saw this during the pandemic, well, I guess we still have COVID out there, but what people are willing to do to protect this,
Yeah.
and the cost that it may be
To
to others was something to really notice in New
Yeah.
York. And I think it had to do with the fear of getting the virus themselves and therefore maybe dying, which was like, I've got to protect this at all costs.
Yeah.
And if I have to, if what I need to make that happen, 100 people are going to suffer, well, that's okay.
Right. Right.
And that led to a very, a lot of unintended consequences and suffering by others.
Yes, absolutely. Because, like the guide says, like in the ego state of consciousness, the most important thing is I.
Yeah.
Right? And in the unitive state, it's all of us. Right? And so it's like in that ego state of consciousness, the emphasis is always going to be on the I. Right? But the fear of losing this doesn't allow us to move in that direction. So we have to address the fear of death, whatever death is for you, aging, relevancy, physical death, ego death, like whatever that, all of the above, so that the energy is not being channeled towards self-preservation. Because channeling it only towards self-preservation is limiting, especially when we're trying to impact change. Okay, next slide. Okay. So this first one's been interesting for me, this idea. So the guide says that like, again, the more indifferent, the more alienated we are from our own pain, the more alienated we are from other people's pain, right? And so when a lot of the DEI stuff started to come up, and I was in different communities, and there were a lot of people in my community from the Black community who were very much wanting to have us feel their pain. And I didn't. And I couldn't figure out why. I mean, I was like, why aren't I feeling a certain sensitivity or certain, and what I realized as a Jew is that I was so cut off from my own pain, right? Growing up as a Jew, you're taught, pull your pants up, get out, don't complain, you're not a victim, you rise above it and you do good in the world, and then keep your head up. That's what I was taught. That's what came down to me. This idea of like feeling like I was a victim. No. It was the opposite. It was like, feel special, be special. That makes you safe, right? Don't play the victim. And so it's like my own alienation from that pain of being part of a victimized people had me completely indifferent to the victimization and the pain of someone else's. Right? So I really had to do my own work to feel the pain of what it meant to be a Jew and what that means. Right? And as I was doing that, my heart just started to open to other people who were expressing the places where they had been victimized. Whereas before I couldn't, it wasn't that I was cruel, I just couldn't feel it. I was like detached from it. Right? So the guide says the more we alienate from our own pain, the more alienated we are to others. And how can we possibly change the world or make it a better place if we don't feel the pain of someone else's suffering? We might feel guilty for it, that's different, right?
It's like, look what I've been through, the scrape on your knee is nothing, yes.
Right.
If you don't allow yourself to be also
Yes.
feeling what you...
Yeah, when you really allow yourself to feel the place where you've been hurt, you're much more apt to really genuinely feel like the pain of someone else. And in that place, we want to move the world forward. We want to make it better. So to the extent that you deny your own pain, Like that's having an impact out there. That's having an impact in the outer reality. And the flip side of this, though, is that, there is a grievance consciousness in our culture right now, right? There is a place where we use victimization as a way to not have to be responsible, right? Where we stay in the place of blame, or we say, you owe this to me, or you have to do this for me, or you have to suffer now, right? And so we also have to be really aware of the places in us that uses victimization as a source of power, right? And that's an uncomfortable conversation to have with people. How are you using your own victimization to maintain a certain level of power? By blaming other, by shaming other, by dehumanizing other, by taking the other's power away. Like, we have to own that place in us. And you can think about it in your own childhood. It's like if you're still blaming your parents, that's a really good example, right? I mean, I am. But like if I'm still like, well, you don't understand how I grew up. It's like, okay, I hear you. And as a child, you were victimized, absolutely. Or as a person in a certain population, absolutely. And where you be using that place of victim to stay, to maintain, to get power, to inflict revenge. Like, what's going on there?
And just to stay separated, because the
To
ego
stay separate.
loves to be separated.
Yes. So grievance consciousness can be a way to not have to take responsibility. But at the same time, there are victims out there. And there is pain and suffering. And so these two things go hand in hand, because it's like we have to know that there are indeed victims out there, and we must feel including ourselves, and feel the pain of that. And we also must not use our victimization as a power play, right? Because that's mask. That's something else, right? Okay, next slide. We're almost there. Anyone self-righteous in the room? Okay, good. I mean, you feel that in the debates. When you watch debates, there is a real sense of self-righteousness, right? Which is pride, essentially, right? And we are not able to really listen past disagreement, or past the agreement, if we literally feel our own superiority. So we have to feel the place that thinks, I know what I'm talking about, you don't. I'm right, you're wrong. Right? You're a bleeding liberal, you're a heartless conservative. It's like, what does even that mean? What does that mean? What part of you is that coming out of, to throw to hurl that towards someone, right? So we have to own the place that feels superior, right? And humble ourselves, God forbid, to the idea that someone else might hold an idea that may be different from you, but maybe they're right too. And then what would you have to feel if that were true? Because we'd have to give up something in order to say, you know what, you might be right. Maybe I was thinking about that not in the right way. And so if we hold a lot of pride, it's going to be difficult to let go of our self-righteousness. And if we can't let go of our self-righteousness, we can't really humble ourselves to be in compromise and to be in real debate, so that we can come to a better idea. So we talked about containment. I like this. This is, I can't remember which lecture. I think it's be of the world. Be, what's the lecture? Be in the world, not of the world.
Yes.
Or the opposite. Do
Yes.
something. The lecture should just be called Do Something, because I can never remember the title. But inertia is the part of us that knows that we have divine consciousness and life force in us that's meant to do something in this world. But for whatever reason, we refuse to use it. Like there's a refusal to claim our greatness, right? And we probably do it, I mean, we do it for lots of reasons, like resignation, like we've been so hurt that there's just a collapse, right? Or we do it as part of the lower self, which is like, you screwed me, God, so I'm not doing your work, right? It's some reaction to being hurt that we don't claim our greatness. And so it's like by not claiming our greatness, like we don't step out into the world and leave our mark. And in order to affect change, you've got to step out and leave a mark, right? So you've got to find the place in us that's either resigned or collapsed or rebelling, like feels a sense of power by not giving. Does that make sense? That we feel power by not stepping into God's work, right? It's like the child, the adult who has a child in them who doesn't want to grow up because they're waiting for someone to take care of them, is not going to step into their higher purpose because they're going to have to leave behind that thing they wanted so badly, which was someone to care for them. Right? So it's like, we don't want the responsibility, not because we're lazy. I mean, we might be. Like, I can be lazy, but there's also a place where it's like, you know, in that one lecture about confronting the lower self, it's like, we don't forgive because forgiveness is an act of yes. And as soon as we say yes, we accelerate the dying process. And so if there's a fear of death, then we're going to not say yes. We're going to say no. We're not going to forgive. You back that up, right? I just said a lot in that one sentence. Okay. When I read it, I was like, this is genius. Okay. The guide says that, like, forgiveness, our lack of ability to forgive, is related to our fear of death. Why? Because because forgiveness is us saying yes to life. Like, we're willing to say, this hurt me, like it shut me down, but I'm gonna move towards living again. So it's an act of yes, right? So we're saying yes to life and to living. And when we say yes to life and living, we are moving, we are getting closer to death. Like, there's a lot of people who say, I don't want to be successful because it's going to get taken from me one day. Like, I'll have more to lose. If I just sit on the bench, at least I was at the game, but I wasn't on the field. I don't have to feel the loss of being on the field. So I'll live at 30% on the bench rather than 100% on the field, right? So if we fear death, then we're going to try to slow this process down, which is not say yes a lot. We're going to say no a lot more. And forgiveness in this lecture what the guide says is forgiveness is an act of yes. Whew. Isn't that so cool? Like, that idea, does this make sense to anyone else?
Well, it's a concept.
But does it make sense? Can anyone, like, the more we're saying yes, the closer we are to death.
I don't get that. How is that?
Because
You mean death of me individually as Joel?
No,
And
it's
my
like,
ego self identity?
it's like, it's all a distortion, but it's this idea that, like, if I say no, I'm slowing time down. Or
okay.
I'm sort of like pushing off something.
Okay, I got you.
So all of a sudden time goes slower, and death will come later.
So I say yes, things are gonna go faster, I'm gonna use myself up more quickly.
Well,
No, I
you're just
can't-
in the game. You're just
in it.
just in the life force, and the life force will take you ultimately to death. That's why people don't want anything to change. Just keep
Yes,
stagnation,
exactly.
because that's also not march. When you're in the life force, you're inevitably moving towards
Yes.
death.
But for me, it's kind of like, are you accepting life
Yes.
as is or not accepting
Yes.
life?
That's
If you resist life, you don't forgive.
Yes.
You fight that.
yes.
So it's not death probably on the physical dying, but there are many moments
Many
of
deaths.
death, many
Yeah.
deaths.
This fear of
That-
death is
so-
not just physical death.
Yes.
It's the pride
Ex-
of saying, wow, someone really actually could hurt me. I
Yes.
actually got hurt. That's death.
And the question is, why do you don't forgive in the first place?
Well, that's a separate right,
But it is answering the question in some ways, because you resist something, you don't accept something.
Yes.
No, and anyway.
Yeah, I feel like we're saying a very similar thing,
Yeah.
and again, and this lecture just says that forgiveness. In this lecture, the interpretation is that forgiveness is yes, and yes is life, and so by forgiving, we're saying yes to life. By not forgiving, we're saying no to life. And someone then needs to ask, well, why would I say no to life? What is it that I'm so afraid of that I feel like I have to say no?
There is another angle, maybe that's what Paz was referring to. Let's say a friend hurt me and betrayed me in some ways. So the ultimate things to forgive is internal. It's not about the friend.
Correct.
It's to let go of that.
Yes.
Is to accept whatever decision you want to make and move forward.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to have a relationship with that friend, that's okay.
Yes.
But you are free. You're coming from a conscious law, from the higher
Yes.
self. You make whatever choices you make.
Yes.
But it is from you.
Yes.
And if you don't want to be that, maybe that's what it's referring, not forgiving.
Yeah.
But
That's
it's
okay.
kind of like maybe kind of choose of words
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah. However what I appreciate about these lectures, it's like whatever words call to you, or whatever your interpretation of those words are, or your interpretation to their interpretation, like acceptance, freedom, saying yes. I mean, I think we're all in the same vein of and I hear you. Like, scars are okay. It's all good. But I will challenge you to say, like, I believe that if you're not forgiving, there's there's pride in that. There's a holding on to it. And when we hold on to something, it's like if I'm holding on to this pen, like, it's keeping me from taking something with this hand because I'm gripping to this pen, right? So now I only have one hand to go do something with, not this hand. Okay, that's fine. That's a choice. But it's like that feels like what this is about. It's like the not forgiving is just us holding on to the pen. And what impact does that have? We get to choose. It's a deeply humbling process because you really have to work through the shame, the humiliation, the sort of self-annihilation where you make yourself bad, and then you just get to the place, that higher self place of remorse, where you're like, wow, I really hurt this person. Like, or I really hurt, like, my own distortions, my own defenses, my own cruelty had this impact on this person, and I feel it. And I don't want to justify it, and I don't want to defend myself. I just want to feel it and make up for it somehow, right? And like that's a death. That humbling, if we're in righteousness or pride, like humbling is a certain death. It's a good death. Okay, next slide. I mean, confusion, this to me is just, I should put like the media. But you can, I mean, I'm guilty of this in my own life. It's like we use confusion and distortion and half-truths to not take responsibility for some truth that we need to, right? So if you turn on the news, people are telling half-truths and distortions, and they're trying to confuse you for their own agenda. But, again, we can do this in our own relationships a lot, right? And it goes back to this idea of pride. It's like, I don't want to feel the impact of the truth of something, and so I'll confuse or distort or manipulate so that I don't have to take ownership. And so where do you do that in your life? Next slide. Okay. I think idealized self-image work is one of the most important things we need to do collectively and individually, but certainly if we want to make change in the world. Because if your idealized image of America, as an example, is that it's the best place on earth, it's going to be really hard for you to confront the places where it isn't. And so we kind of have to be willing to give up. And it's hard to give up the idealized self because it serves us, it makes us feel safe. But we have to look at our own, like, I'm a giving person, I care about the world, I'm always doing God's work. It's like, that's my idealized image. That's not true. It's true a lot, but it certainly isn't always true. I'm doing the opposite of those things. And so as long as we're in our idealized self, we cannot do the work we need to do to actually make change. Because the idealized self will never let us acknowledge that we've done harm. Right? So we've got to be willing to, I think a lot of the DEI work is from the idealized self. This idea of like wanting to, create racial change. It's like a lot of it's coming from this masky, idealized, and we're not really owning things that we need to own about ourselves before we can really impact change. We have to own our racism. We have to own our anti-Semitism. We have to own our misogyny. We have to own our own internalized patriarchy. Like, we've got to own that. We can't pretend we are above that because we're not. You might, you can argue that you are. Right? So it's like, you know, an exercise I think you could do is like when you think about your role as an activist or someone that tries to impact change, like where are you in your idealized self and where are you in your higher self? And the places where you're in your idealized self, like that's where you have to do your work. Because there's something it's masking. The idealized self is a mask. Right? So what is it you don't want to face that if you did face, because you are in your higher self, you really could make change in the world?
Is the higher self is the one that really, the observer, kind of like the one that witness and guide the whole process?
I mean,
Terminology, you want
Yeah.
to get to ideal to the higher self, but I don't know, again.
I mean, the way that I understand higher self is like, I think that observer self is like even a
Yes,
higher
so that's what I'm
consciousness.
saying, yeah.
Yeah, that observer, I think there's an observer self in the higher self, but there's that higher level of consciousness that I don't think is the higher self. I feel personally when I'm in my higher self, I'm just connected, I'm connected to like the unit of consciousness, I'm connected to core, I'm connected to spirit, like that's, it's like I'm just in flow, I'm in truth, even if that truth is painful. And then there's the observer consciousness that's even above that. That's how I experience it.
Yeah, it's a little bit kind of. Okay, can go on and on, but it's okay.
Okay. I mean, yeah. Yeah. Are you good?
I always was kind of like challenged by, again, in some Buddhism that there is universal self and there is the individual higher self.
Yes.
Yes, but yet at the same time, it's always a good question: who is the self leadership? Who is the self leader
Yes.
that, it's like in IFS, you know,
Yes.
that moves you?
Yes.
Is it part of the higher self, or is it's maybe they are mixed
I mean,
together?
My feeling or understanding, if like the higher self is what allows us to surrender to the unit of consciousness. Like the higher self is the place where we can surrender the ego over to that greater consciousness. So to me, the higher self is that individualized sort of higher self, connected self, God self.
So to me, when I'm aware, like let's say you're aware that you're really upset about what's happened and you're angry and how are you going to contain this? What are you going to do? You want to pause, right?
Mm-hmm.
That in that pause, there's a self-awareness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where you're sitting with your feelings. And so to me, that's the higher self,
Mm-hmm.
self being expressed,
Yeah.
and that's also the universal consciousness.
Yeah.
That's at one with you in that.
I agree with you, and my own personal experience is like something happens where there's when I feel like I'm in my higher self, there's an act of giving over. And so I'm presuming that giving over means I'm connecting my individualized higher self with the unit of consciousness. So I think it's just I think it's semantics, but it's just my own experience of what I notice in myself when I'm in my higher self.
Yeah.
That I'm allowing, when I'm in my higher self, I feel the willingness and desire to surrender over my ego to the unit of state. So there's some way in which like those are two separate things, not
Gotcha.
separate, but they're steps or
understand.
transitions.
Definitely. It's like I feel like I'm connected to the mothership.
That's, yeah, yes.
And I can be in my observer self and be observing that I'm in my higher self, or I could also be in my observer self and observing that I'm in my lower self.
Yeah,
Or in my mask.
yeah.
So the observer is what it is, it's the observer. But yeah, I can feel it when I'm connected to my higher self. It's physical sensation as well as an emotional sensation.
Yeah.
And it almost feels sometimes like a vibration that I can feel. It's approaching a kind of a tingling sensation. But I definitely feel like you know, I'm the car at the gas pump and the gas is in my, I'm being refueled.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's great for each of us to have our own interpretation or experience of that.
And it's
right?
hard to describe it in words.
It is.
So we're already challenged by trying to describe such an unusual or easy, you know.
It's a feeling, and then it often translates into an action.
Right.
You know, I think when we see like people in their humanity, it's like there's something where they have that feeling, they're in that vibration, and then they act on it. And so that's why it's like, imagine what we could do in the world if we came at it from our higher self. That's why we have to do the work to work through the mask and the lower self, so that we can live in the higher self, so that we do the work that we need to do.
I once read, I don't remember exactly where was that, kind of the parallel of higher self and lower self about the mature person, the adult and the child. Yeah, it's kind of like mature and immature. And so the higher self is the mature self, and the lower self is the child. And basically the role of the adult or the higher self is to guide that immature part of us to the maturity, to part of maturity.
Yes. That's why we don't do lower self work until we've connected with the higher self. Because the higher self is the adult self that says to the child self, yes, you've got all this negativity, and yes, you've got all this cruelty and this no to life and this untrusting, but I can help you through. If we just come at the lower self without the higher self, we'll self-annihilate ourselves, because we'll be like, I'm a horrible person, right? So, yeah. So I'm going to skip these last two just because I'm out of time. I mean, collusion and complicity, I think, speaks for itself. And Alan, when he made the introduction, sort of spoke to this, which is like, where don't I speak up? Right? Like, silence is complicity sometimes. Colluding with a system because you benefit from it is still colluding. Right? Where do I look the other way? Where do I see something but I don't say something, because if I were to say something, I could experience some loss or some exile from the tribe, right? And we have to feel the impact that has on us personally, and then the impact it has on the system that we're part of. Okay, next slide. I think we talked about this. Yeah. I mean, everything we've talked about has an element of self-will, which is my way. Pride, which is I'm not going to feel my vulnerability, my hurt, like I'm not going to be wrong, not going to be humble. And the fear is fear, right? And so these three things these are all, the guide says these are all denials of truth. So if we're in self-will, pride, or fear, we're not in truth. And if we're not in truth, we can't really impact change. Next slide. Okay, we've got two left. So, the way we work through the lower self and these sort of aspects of the mask and lower self is we have to feel the pleasure that we get from behaving the way that we do. So if you get pleasure out of demonizing the other, you gotta work through that. If you get pleasure from blaming another person, you've gotta feel that. Because in the pleasure is some power. Like, to demonize someone else, you feel powerful, but it's pseudo power, and it's not real pleasure. It's negative pleasure. That's really hard to give up, because we don't want to give up pleasure. But the only way we really can sort of work through these aspects that are impacting or obstructing our ability to make change is we have to be willing to give up the pleasure we get from doing it. Does that make sense? This idea of negative pleasure. Do you know negative pleasure in yourself? That smile tells me everything, right? Yeah. Yeah.
This is good pleasure, by the way.
Yeah. No, but it's very hard to, again, it's really hard to give it up because we don't want to give up pleasure. And we don't want to give up feeling powerful. But if we can trust that power and that pleasure isn't real, and that by giving it up, we actually get to move towards real pleasure and real power, then we can be willing to do that. But we have to be willing to give it up. But if we can trust that by giving up the negative pleasure, we're going to be asked to feel those unfeelable feelings, right? But the negative pleasure compensated for, right? Like the powerlessness and the helplessness and the despair and the grief and the terror. Like if we can let ourselves feel those things, we don't need the negative pleasure.
Yeah,
Right?
that's the most
That's what makes it
important
hard to give up. Because not only is
Yeah.
it pleasurable and powerful, but the alternative now is that you have to feel really shitty feelings.
part. Yeah, I think it boils down to that in the long run, being able to, I mean, I think, that the whole pathwork philosophy boils down to that, to really being able to face that pain,
Mhm.
that discomfort, and really having that willingness and honest desire to encounter truth,
Yes.
to want truth, regardless.
Yes.
No matter what you have to go through for
Yes.
it. I mean, the example Alan gave earlier about your grandfather, I think it was. That's a beautiful one, I think.
Yes.
Because, and there's so much to say about that, because I think that, what was going through his mind when he decided to go this way. I think, personally, that he was just following his intuition,
Mhm.
his inner morality.
Yes.
And he said, I'm going to go through this because this seems more harmonious, this seems to be aligned with my inner self and my principles, inner principles.
Yeah.
And he went with it, and sure enough, that saved his life,
Yeah.
right? And there's so many instances in life, presently even, where we have to make that decision. And maybe not so much a big way when our own life, physical life, is going to be compromised.
Yeah.
But in little ways, where you have to really choose, really choose, am I going to go follow the crowd and go with the falsehood way of being, or really align with truth and just take whatever comes?
Yes.
And that path is always the best.
Yes.
It's always the best to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. And the guide says that like the greatest form of suffering is self-alienation, right? And so that self-betrayal, and again, it makes
Yes,
sense. We
that's
self-betray because we want to preserve life. So we think, I need this person
Yeah.
to live, so I can't do my own thing because I'll lose the connection of the person that's going to keep me alive. That's the child consciousness. It's
Yeah,
the
but that's the
dependency.
erroneous, right? That's the ego. That's an illusion, because if you go with the ego way, you're really going to lose your life.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
higher self-truth, but I think,
Yeah.
and as you can, the more conscious you become, the more you can say, wait a minute, yes, I think I'm preserving my life, but I'm actually losing it because
Yeah.
I'm staying dependent on this other. I'm staying in the child consciousness, not standing in my full adult self. And so that realization takes time. We have to become aware that we're even doing that.
Yeah, it takes, again, facing that pain and encountering, and going through that discomfort so
Yes.
that you can, arrive at this, comfort inner state
Yes,
of
absolutely.
being, which is the truthful state, or the true state of being that's going to really ensure that, your true life.
Yeah, absolutely.
It comes to mind to me when Jesus says, if you want to save your life, you will lose it. In my opinion, he's referring to the life of the ego. That's the illusion of the ego, that if you want to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose it for the sake, or my sake, which means truth,
Okay.
then you're going to save
Yes.
it. You know what I mean? So he's referring to the life of the ego, to this illusion that the ego wants to make us believe that the external life, as you were saying earlier, is all there is to it.
Yeah, right.
Which is totally
Right.
not true.
Right, and
as we know.
that's what causes that's the anti-aging movement.
Well,
Right, again, that
exactly.
goes back to like trying to put all our energy towards preserving the ego.
Yeah, that external shell,
Not
which is
living.
eventually has to go.
Yeah, it has to go. Yes, okay, so
yeah,
last slide.
it's-
Can you give example about positive pleasure?
What is positive? Yeah, I
Yeah, I don't
mean,
know.
I would say, pleasure is life force moving towards
Love?
love, like life force moving towards expansion and creation.
Okay.
Negative pleasure is life force moving
Contraction.
towards destruction,
Okay.
right? And so it might feel good, right? It
Yeah.
feels good to say you hate people because you don't support this policy. It feels good to do that, but that's your energy moving towards destructive force because you're creating separation in that.
So if morality meets, let's say, pleasure, that's good.
I think so,
Yeah, makes sense.
yeah. Okay, one more slide.
Two more.
I love this. I love this slide or this quote because I think I self-deceive every second of my life. But like, I love this idea that and I think this is such a helpful frame for us as we think about how to be activists in the world, which is like we have to go back to your question about your statement about purifying motivation. It's like, well, let's read. Someone want to read this?
Yeah. Some of you may be very committed to God on a conscious level, but you may not realize at all that there are other levels in you where this is not the case. Consciously, you may be full of goodwill and really mean it. But unless you have come to experience the contradictory levels within you, where you do not wish that, or where you only wish it on your own ego terms, which defeats the very act of self-surrender, you will not want to walk. Unless you own up to the contrary ego level hidden behind your goodwill, you may not even understand why certain results are still lacking, despite your conscious commitment to truth, to God, to love. So awesome.
Right? I mean, so I think that I believe that there's a part of all of us that really is committed to making the world better, right? To actually affecting change. And in this language, committed to God. That doesn't have to be anyone else's language. But there's also a part of us that doesn't. And it's unconscious oftentimes, or it's the ego, or it's the distortions. It's the idea that if I commit to God, then I give up my own individualized need. And I don't want to give that up. And so this idea of or we have to surrender, and we kind of don't want to, we're willing, but we're not willing. And so I love this slide because I think it always invites us on a day-to-day basis to say where am I saying one thing, but there's contradictory ideas and beliefs in me that are not really allowing me to go forward in my commitment to change. And so being aware of both negative pleasure and self-deception, I just think is a really important aspect of understanding how to really impact change. Next slide. Last slide, right?
Right.
Right, so this is from the spiritual meaning of crisis. So our outer desire for collective maturity and our inner desire to stay stagnant or direct our energy towards the negative pleasure of destruction is perpetuating and exacerbating the crisis. I wrote this, sorry. Sorry. I wrote this. The reconciliation of these opposites.
So what I said sounds like the guy.
Yeah.
You realize it's
No,
so
to
great.
respect.
I know,
That's
but
unbelievable.
that's
Wow. I didn't realize it's me.
I didn't want to quote the guy wrong, so I did have to own that I wrote it. Not to say it's good, because I knew it. The reconciliation of these opposite desires is needed so that, now this is the guy, when the crisis is over, we can know it's fulfilled its function. So when we reconcile the opposites of what we say we want in terms of a better world, but what we are not willing to do or think or have or change or let go of or commit to, all of that, then we're going to perpetuate the crisis. And so when we reconcile those two opposites of a desire to change and the willingness to pay the price to make that change, then we can know the crisis will end and we'll know it's fulfilled its function.